The American auto industry has certainly churned out a number of vehicles that one could describe as quirky, but it's going to be hard to top a vehicle like the AMC Pacer in terms of quirkiness. American Motors certainly produced some strange vehicles, some of which were successful, like the Gremlin, America's first subcompact, and some of which were not, like the Matador Coupe that came out for 1974. The Pacer kind of straddles that line between success and failure, having sold extremely well in its introductory model year, but then fading quickly from initial sales success as early adopters had already procured their Pacer in the 1975 and 76 model years, and gasoline prices started to decrease ahead of the 1979 oil crisis, during which they would again spike. The Pacer, though, is one of those cars that is beloved by the AMC fan base, and for good reason. It was also a car that brought to market the first wide, small car, if you will. A car that really had on the inside the dimensions of an intermediate, at least in terms of overall width and shoulder room as well as hip room, but it was pretty short overall. This was the perfect car for the perfect time when it was planned, during which it was thought that gasoline prices were going to remain elevated for a long period of time. So what could have been better than a car that was physically compact but provided good amounts of space inside? The Pacer was really conceived by two individuals in their teams at AMC, one of which was Gerald Myers, who led product planning at AMC at the time and would later rise to become AMC's chairman and CEO. Myers wanted a vehicle that could help customers move about urban areas with relative ease, and thus the Pacer's short overall length. The other individual who helped give life to the Pacer was AMC's chief designer, Dick Teague, and on Dick Teague's staff, Bob Nixon, who was one of his designers. Both Nixon and Teague wanted a vehicle that was both sleek and svelte, and it'd be hard to describe the final Pacer with those two adjectives, but there are reasons for that we're going to go into here in a moment. You see, the original concept for the Pacer was significantly different than what ended up in dealer showrooms. And it really was because of a series of unfortunate decisions that were made, some of which by AMC, some of which were made by competitors, that left AMC a bit in the lurch when developing the Pacer and forcing it to adapt to some changing circumstances. One of the main differences was to be the engine under hood in these Pacers, which, as opposed to being the standard 6 cylinders, even the later 8-cylinder for AMC, was intended to be a Wankel rotary engine. Now, Wankels are unique engines in that they don't have typical pistons. Instead, they have this rotor that wobbles on a cam, and there's 3 different combustion chambers, effectively, that get squeezed, or the air-fuel ratio is compressed and then ignited. And they're known for being extremely smooth, but they certainly had their challenges, at least the Wankels from the 1970s. One challenge was that you can imagine, given the odd shape of the combustion chambers and the way in which the rotor moved, those tip seals were very challenging to ensure that they didn't wear out prematurely. And after a while, there would be some blow-by in the engine. And the other issue associated with them was just emission control. These engines were not known for doing well when it came to emissions. Lastly, Wankels also weren't highly fuel efficient. It was for these reasons that the Wankel engine was eventually killed in the Pacer. AMC was not going to build its own Wankel rotary engine. In fact, it was looking to purchase engines from a number of suppliers, either Co-Motor, which was one of the suppliers to whom Curtiss Wright had licensed the rights to make Wankels, or General Motors. General Motors was later selected to be the supplier for AMC after it definitively decided that it didn't want to produce its own Wankel engines. GM had intended to use the Wankel in everything from the Vega, which would have had a 2-rotor design, to the Corvette, which would have employed a 4-rotor design, and a number of concept vehicles that GM introduced during this time period displayed rotary engines, most notably the 4-rotor and 2-rotor Corvette. The 4-rotor Corvette shown here, and the 2-rotor Corvette shown here. But General Motors killed the Wankel engine after it encountered a number of issues similar to what I just related, namely emissions challenges as well as fuel economy challenges, and stuck with conventional engines. Therefore, AMC was consequently stuck shoehorning one of its inline six cylinders under hood, or multiple. In fact, the Pacer would come with the 232 or 258 cubic inch six cylinder under hood, depending upon what year Pacer and what option content you received. And later, AMC would even shoehorn its 304 cubic inch V8 under hood for a few model years. And while the loss of the Wankel engine was certainly a blow to the Pacer, another blow would come in the form of AMC's own legal department, which became increasingly wary of new motor vehicle safety standards, requiring pretty aggressive side impact standards to be met for these vehicles. As a consequence, the Pacer's engineers and designers were ordered to make sure that the car could attain a very high level of crashworthiness in terms of side impact standards, which meant that the design went from something that was intended to be sleek and svelte overall to a little bit, shall we say, corpulent in final form. Undeterred, AMC soldiered on in its mission of making the Pacer the first wide small car. And to this end, the Pacer that came out ended up riding atop a 100-inch wheelbase, meaning it was a compact and it was only 172 inches long. This was just about an inch longer than the Gremlin. However, despite its overall short length, the Pacer was 77 inches wide. That was almost the width of the big Matadors and Ambassadors. So the Pacer really was wide. It was just about an inch narrower than a Matador and Ambassador on the inside, but only an inch longer than the Gremlin from stem to stern. Moreover, the Pacer had so much glass area that drivers as well as their passengers felt like they were in a bigger car than they really were because they had such great sight lines and an open and airy cabin. In fact, the cabin was so open and airy that almost 40% of the car's total surface area was glass, and AMC actually had to employ a strange door panel with a raised section on it to disguise the fact that the window glass couldn't drop down all the way inside the door. You can see here in this picture of the AMC Pacer door panel that the top of it rises atop the belt line in order to disguise the fact that the glass doesn't go all the way down. The door panel also had some unique placements of the door lock plunger, which was not in the typical location atop of the door panel, largely because that top of the door panel had that raised section to disguise the fact that the glass couldn't lower all the way. Instead, the door lock plunger was located right atop the door handle, and you can see here on the driver's door panel, the mirror control was in the same area. While the car was small overall in terms of its length, AMC did try to make it easier for passengers to get into the rear compartment of the vehicle by making the passenger side door 4 inches longer than the driver's side door, thus enabling a larger opening for a passenger to climb into the rear. Engineers also designed the car with a unique clamshell-style hood that was not employed by many domestics at the time, although it was relatively popular in Europe. This aided, at least a little bit, in servicing the inline six-cylinder engines in particular, where the back spark plugs were tucked underneath the top of the cowl. This really was one of the first cab-forward designs when it comes to an American car, as the Pacer had a pretty stubby hood under which AMC had to shoehorn those two six-cylinders, its 232 and 258 cubic inch six-cylinder, after the Wankel engine was shelved. AMC engineers also gave the Pacer a number of firsts when it came to American vehicles. The first was the underbody rack and pinion steering, which you can see depicted here. This was a significant departure from the typical recirculating ball steering that most every American car used at the time, and it endowed the Pacer with a wonderful steering feel. Another engineering first was really done for cost reasons, and that is the Pacer was the first vehicle, at least to my knowledge, to employ blacked-out window trim, which obviated the need for finishing off some of the garnish trim underneath it. This saved assembly time, and nobody really cared what the garnish trim looked like or if it was finished appropriately under that blacked-out windshield area, which, by the way, cars still use today. All in all, the Pacer proved highly successful in its first two model years, with production totaling 72,000 units in 1975 and 117,000 units in 1976. However, by 1977, Pacer sales started to dwindle despite the fact that AMC introduced a new two-door wagon. The wagon also rode atop the same 100-inch wheelbase, but it had greater overall length, and it gave the car a little less pudgy appearance, but I just don't think it has the same charisma as the original Pacer. Regardless, in 1977, when both body styles were available, AMC only sold 58,000 Pacers, of which 38,000 were wagons and 20,000 were sedans. By 1978, sales had dwindled even further to 21,200 units, of which 13,800 were wagons and 7,400 were hatchback sedans. In 1979, total sales would drop to 10,215, and by 1980, only 1,746 Pacers were available. In 1979 and 1980, AMC only offered the Pacer in the upper level DL and the highest level limited trim, in which the interiors were quite luxurious for the time. And while the car was introduced with six-cylinder engines under hood, the Pacer in 1978 could be ordered with AMC's 304 cubic inch V8. It really didn't do much for power. It was more just for advertising, I would say, as depending upon the year, the 304 cubic inch V8 made around 130 horsepower, or even a little less. It certainly wasn't going to endow the Pacer with neck-snapping acceleration. Another quirky feature of these Pacers came in the form of the instrument panel, which had pretty typical gauges overall, but I think one cool gauge that these Pacers had was the tachometer, which was put in place of where a clock might be if that were ordered. And it was kind of this strange vertically oriented tachometer that was often found in vehicles like the early Pacer X's if the customers ordered those. I haven't really seen a similar tachometer like this on other American cars, and I just thought it was strange and worth noting. Overall, despite being that first wide small car, the Pacer, as I mentioned, was pretty successful in its early years, and then sales really dwindled, particularly after AMC introduced the Concorde for the 1978 model year, which was really a gussied-up Hornet that they effectively remarketed as almost an all-new car when it really wasn't anything near all-new under hood or in the chassis department or pretty much anywhere else. AMC's marketing folks were just pretty genius in that regard. But perhaps they marketed the Pacer in a little bit of a strange and maybe even incorrect way. Well, AMC always called it the first wide small car. Perhaps they really should have leaned into the fact that it was intermediate in terms of its interior dimensions, but compact in size. This was a time period in which it was getting increasingly difficult for companies to get Americans to buy compact vehicles, especially when some of them didn't have the most sterling reputations and kind of polluted the marketplace when it came to the overall compact car brand. It also didn't help the gasoline prices, as I mentioned, were generally decreasing in real terms throughout the 1970s until that second oil crisis. In any case, I hope you enjoyed the spotlight on AMC's homely Pacer, and if you did, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and check out the video thumbnails at bottom left and right for some suggestions for you. Thanks again for watching.